Good afternoon and welcome to Lunch Break Live with Tea Party Patriots Action. I'm Bill Pasco, Tea Party Patriots man in Washington, and I'm flying solo this week. I'll be bringing you this week's Washington Report and the calls to action. So let's get to it. Here's our Washington Report for Monday, May 1. The House is in recess this week. The Senate will return today and stay in session through Thursday. Last week in the House came back to work on Tuesday and took up and passed two bills under suspension of the rules. On Wednesday, the House took up and passed the rule governing floor consideration of the bill to raise the debt ceiling, H.R. 2811, the Limit, Save, Grow Act. As is quite common, the rule passed on a straight party line vote, 219 to 210. Then the House took up and passed a bill under suspension of the rules. And then the House took up and passed H.R. 2811, the Limit, Save, Grow Act, by a single vote, 217 to 215. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Then the House took up and passed another bill under suspension. On Thursday, the House took up H-Con Res 30, directing the President, pursuant to Section 5C of the War Powers Resolution, to remove all United States armed forces, other than United States armed forces assigned to protect the United States Embassy, from Somalia. The resolution failed by a vote of 102 to 321, with Republicans voting 52 to 165, and Democrats voting 50 to 156. On Friday, the House took up H.J. Res. 39, a Congressional Review Act resolution of disapproval, disapproving the rule submitted by the Department of Commerce relating to procedures covering suspension of liquidation, duties, and estimated duties in accord with Presidential Proclamation 10414. This is a significant CRA resolution of disapproval against a Biden administration action. A June 2022 emergency proclamation allows imports of Chinese solar products with no additional tariffs for 2 years, guaranteeing unfair competition for American solar panel manufacturers. Congressman Bill Posey's H.J. Res. 39 would block this rule from going into effect, and would thereby reinstate tariffs on solar panel imports. The resolution passed by a vote of 221 to 202, with 12 Democrats crossing party lines to vote in favor of it, and 8 Republicans crossing party lines to vote against it. And then they were done. Last week in the Senate came back on Tuesday and voted to invoke cloture on the nomination of Joshua David Jacobs to be Undersecretary for Benefits of the Department of Veterans Affairs. On Wednesday, the Senate voted to confirm him to that position. Then the Senate voted to invoke cloture on the motion to proceed to S-326, a bill to direct the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to carry out a study and clinical trials on the effects of cannabis on certain health outcomes of veterans with chronic pain and post-traumatic stress disorder. The resolution was rejected by a vote of 57 to 42. Then the Senate took up and passed S.J. Res. 11, a Congressional Review Act resolution of disapproval of the rule submitted by the Environmental Protection Agency relating to control of air pollution from new motor vehicles, heavy-duty engine and vehicle standards. The Senate rejected the resolution by a vote of 51 to 47. On Thursday, the Senate took up S.J. Res. 4, a joint resolution removing the deadline for ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. The Senate rejected the resolution by a vote of 51 to 47. Then the Senate voted to invoke cloture on the nomination of Anthony DeVos Johnstone to be a U.S. Circuit Judge for the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And then they were done. This week in the Senate will return today with the first vote set for 5:30 p.m. At that time, the Senate is scheduled to proceed to a roll call vote on confirmation of Anthony DeVos Johnstone to be a U.S. Circuit Judge for the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. In addition, Majority Leader Schumer may attempt to bring to the floor, via a unanimous consent request, a resolution condemning former President Trump's call to defund the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Justice. Now to the continuing Biden crime family saga. On Thursday, the House Ways and Means Committee held an oversight hearing with Commissioner of Internal Revenue Danny Werfel. Committee Chairman Jason Smith, Republican of Missouri, spoke to Werfel in his opening remarks of the appearance the previous week of an IRS whistleblower. Quote, "Last week, A whistleblower came forward with troubling claims about abuses of power, he said. We are conducting a review of this matter and will go wherever the facts lead us. I expect full cooperation from the IRS, particularly with regard to ensuring this whistleblower is protected from retaliation. The Ways and Means Committee officially sent a letter authorizing 2 attorneys for the IRS whistleblower to gather information from their client about what alleged wrongdoing he claims he witnessed and to transmit that information to Congress. That letter frees him and his attorneys to send private tax information to the Congress without running afoul of the tax privacy laws. On the other side of the Capitol, Senate Finance Committee Chairman Ron Wyden, Democrat of Oregon, is expected to follow suit. Now to illegal immigration. House Republicans, having pushed through their legislation to raise the debt ceiling in exchange for significant spending cuts, now are preparing for consideration of another hugely important piece of their agenda, legislation to get the border crisis under control. Over the past several weeks, they've been working in 2 separate committees, the Judiciary Committee and the Homeland Security Committee, to put together comprehensive legislation to address the many aspects of the problem. They will combine 2 packages of bills, one from each committee of jurisdiction, and bring them to the floor together in the month of May. Their hope, in fact, is to bring the package to the floor on May 11th, the day President Biden has already announced he will end the COVID public health emergency and, with it, Title 42. Legislation to deal with illegal immigration was one of the House Republicans' highest priorities. The package was originally slated to be considered in late January, just days after the new Congress launched, but ran into trouble when it became clear there were significant disagreements within the conference over the right approach. Leadership delayed the effort amid the infighting between immigration hawks like Chip Roy and centrists like Tony Gonzalez, both of Texas. When Roy first introduced his legislation in the Judiciary Committee, some Republican centrists suggested it made it too difficult for valid asylum seekers to enter the country. They said they would oppose the legislation as written. So it was rewritten to their satisfaction during the Judiciary Committee's 12-hour markup session on April 19. Now to the Julie Su nomination. On Wednesday of last week, the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee voted to advance President Biden's nominee to serve as Secretary of Labor, Julie Su, on a straight party line vote. Her nomination now moves to the full Senate, where her fate is uncertain. California Democrat Senator Dianne Feinstein's continued absence from the Senate as she recovers from a bout with shingles complicates matters for the nomination. Without Feinstein, the Democrats are down to a 50-49 advantage, which means that any single Democrat could block Sue's confirmation by switching sides and voting with the Republicans. As of our last count, there are at least 4 Senate Democrats and 1 independent who have yet to publicly declare their intention to vote for Sue. The 4 Democrats are West Virginia's Joe Manchin, Montana's John Tester, and Arizona's Mark Kelly and Kyrsten Sinema. The independent, who caucuses with the Democrats, is Maine's Angus King. Now let's get to the debt ceiling. H.R. 2811, the Limit, Save, Grow Act, also known as the Debt Ceiling Bill, passed 217 to 215 on Wednesday, but only after New York Republican George Santos, yes, the talented Mr. Santos, called attention to himself by casting the final vote for the measure. The tally hung at 216 to 215, with no time left on the clock, when Santos prompted the clerk to call his name and ask loudly how he would vote. Santos may be only a freshman, but he's been around long enough to learn that votes in the House are not like baseball, where a tie goes to the runner. In the House, a tie vote kills the measure at hand. So with the tally at 216 in favor and 215 opposed, Santos knew he had the power to cast a no vote to tie and therefore kill the bill. With all eyes on him, he demonstrated his loyalty to Speaker McCarthy and his GOP colleagues by casting his vote in favor of the measure. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about the particulars of the bill because it's unlikely the bill will be taken up by the Senate. What the passage of this bill does, that is the reason it's important, is that it shows President Biden and Senate Majority Leader Schumer that when it comes to the debt ceiling, Speaker McCarthy can corral his GOP votes to control the floor of the House. It gives McCarthy chips at the table, so to speak. and shows Biden and Schumer that they have to deal with McCarthy in a way they had hoped they wouldn't have to. The ball is now in Schumer's court. The House has passed a bill to raise the debt ceiling. The House is now the only one of the three legs of the three-legged stool to have done what is necessary to prevent a default. This is not a reconciliation bill. It will need to clear the 60-vote threshold just to get on the floor of the Senate, which means that even if Senator Feinstein has returned, it will still take at least 9 Republican votes to invoke cloture on a motion to proceed to get a debt ceiling increase on the floor of the Senate. And that means that Senator McConnell, who presumably has a good handle on the Republican votes in the upper chamber, has some leverage when he sits with Schumer to discuss what will be in the Senate bill. Since McCarthy and the House have already passed a bill that raises the debt limit, the pressure now will be on Schumer to make concessions to McConnell to get McConnell to agree to provide the needed GOP votes to bring the bill to the floor. The Secretary of the Treasury, you will recall, says she may run out of the ability to deploy her smoke and mirrors accounting tricks to continue funding the government by mid-June. That's just 6 weeks away from now. The clock is ticking. And that's our Washington report for this week. Now let's move to the calls to action. But before we get to that, I want to put in a plug for our new podcast. It's called The Jenny Beth Show. And you can find it on all the major podcast platforms and at YouTube, Rumble, Facebook, or jennybethm.simplecast.com. Now to the calls to action. We have 3 calls to action this week. None of them is new. We're counting on you to continue to burn up the phone lines on important issues. As always, you can find these and all our other calls to action at teapartypatriots.org/take action. That's teapartypatriots.org/take action. The first call to action for this week is to please call both of your United States senators to urge them to vote against the confirmation of Julie Su to serve as Secretary of Labor. As we discussed earlier, she was voted out of the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee last week. And while I don't expect to see her nomination hit the floor of the Senate this week, Senator Feinstein's continued absence makes that problematic for Majority Leader Schumer. She will get to the floor sooner or later, and there's no reason to wait in lodging your opposition to her confirmation. Remember, she was the California Secretary of Labor who was responsible for overseeing more than $30 billion in unemployment insurance fraud. And she was a big supporter of California's AB 5, the legislation that basically made it almost impossible to work as a private contractor in California. We just can't afford her as Secretary of Labor. So call your senators and urge them to oppose the confirmation of Julie Su to serve as Secretary of Labor. The second call to action for this week is to please call both of your United States senators to urge them to vote against any attempt by Senate Democrats to replace California Democrat Senator Dianne Feinstein on the Judiciary Committee. We discussed this last week in the Washington Report. In fact, we've discussed it for the last 2 weeks in the Washington Report. Senator Feinstein is recovering from a bout with the shingles and cannot travel. Her absence from meetings of the Senate Judiciary Committee means that President Biden's most radical and unqualified judicial nominees cannot win a majority vote in the committee. And that means they cannot be sent to the floor for consideration by the full Senate. So Democrats are now trying to do something unprecedented: replace a rank-and-file committee member in the middle of a session of Congress. That's wrong, and the only reason they're doing it is to jam through particularly bad nominees. So please call your 2 U.S. senators and urge them to vote against the Democrats' attempt to replace Senator Feinstein on the Judiciary Committee. The final call to action for this week is to call both of your U.S. senators and your member of the House of Representatives and urge all 3 of them to support Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. For more than 30 years, Justice Clarence Thomas has stood strongly for God, America, and the Constitution. And for more than 30 years, the hard left has been smearing him, trying to get him to step down or be forced off the Supreme Court. He's had our back. It's time we had his. So please, contact your 2 U.S. senators and your member of the House of Representatives and tell them you support Justice Clarence Thomas and you want them to support him too. Again, you can find more information on these and all our other calls to action at teapartypatriots.org/take action. That's teapartypatriots.org/take action. If you have any questions about anything we discussed in today's broadcast, you can send us an email at jenny.beth@teapartypatriots.org. That's jenny.beth@teapartypatriots.org. We did have one question from last week, and that is simply, what are all these Congressional Review Act resolutions of disapproval you keep talking about? Well, the Congressional Review Act is a law that was passed in 1996, signed into law by President Bill Clinton, passed by a Republican House and a Republican Senate. Basically, what the Congressional Review Act does is it says that federal agencies have to get approval from Congress, from both houses of Congress, before they actually begin to implement new rules. When they issue a proposed new rule, they're supposed to send it to the House and send it to the Senate. And each body then has 60 legislative days to review what the agency wants to do. Now, the 60 legislative days is important because that's not 60 days on the calendar. That's 60 days that the House or the Senate was in session. And what can happen, what becomes very interesting when you have a House or a Senate that is controlled by a party other than the party that controls the White House, as, say, for instance, right now, when Republicans control the House while Democrats control the White House and therefore the executive branch. What can happen is that agencies that issued rules towards the end of the previous session of the Congress, that is, within 60 legislative days of the end of that Congress, can find that in the beginning of the next Congress, the House or the Senate might decide to enact a Congressional Review Act resolution of disapproval. Now, a resolution of disapproval is privileged. That is, it does not require 60 votes to move in the Senate. It's a simple majority vote in both houses. So you would introduce it in the House, pass it, send it to the Senate. If it passes the Senate, just like any other piece of legislation, it goes to the president for his signature or his veto. So what's going on here is that Republicans, who have now taken control of the House of Representatives, are using the Congressional Review Act. They're going back through all of the rules that were issued at the end of the Biden administration's second year, that is, within 60 legislative days. Now, because a legislative day is a day when the legislature is in session, 60 legislative days, counting back from the end of the 116th Congress, 60 legislative days might get you as far back as even June or maybe July. So any rule that was issued in the last 6 months of 2022 is therefore subject to review by the new House of Representatives, which happens to be controlled by a different party than the party that controlled the executive branch that issued that rule. So let's say the Biden administration issues a new rule defining waters of the United States. They have the EPA and the Army's Corps of Engineers issue a new rule on the waters of the United States. And then Republicans take control of the House of Representatives. They look at that and they say, my goodness, you want to make a puddle in a farmer's backyard a navigable waterway and make it off limits so the farmer can't fill in that puddle when it rains. That's ridiculous. That's absurd. We're going to overturn that. And they move a resolution through the House that then goes to the Senate. Now, I can tell you, Republicans have been the ones who have used this far more often. As of the end of 2021, it had only been used 20 times. The first time it was used was by the Republican House in, I can't remember what the number of Congress it was, but it was the Congress that was elected in the election of 2000. They went back, and with a Republican now in the White House to sign the bill, and Republicans running the House and the Senate, they went back and they overturned a Clinton administration rule that had been issued at the very end of the Clinton administration. That happened one time in 2001, and then it lay dormant. The Congressional Review Act lay dormant for 16 years. Nobody picked it up and used it again until 2017, when Republicans were in control of the House, and once again, they had taken control of the White House. And in 2017, Republicans were in control of the House and the Senate and the White House, the trifecta, as we call it. And they went to town. They took 16 Obama administration rules that had been issued in the last 6 or 7 months of 2016, and they overturned them. They passed them to the House, they passed them to the Senate, they sent it to the White House, the president signed it, And boom, those rules, those agency rules were overturned. And the fun part, here's the fun part of a Congressional Review Act resolution of disapproval. If it gets signed by the president and it overturns the rule that was issued by the agency, not only is that rule overturned, but it says that any similar rule is also blocked from being advanced in the future. So the agency can't come back the next time they get a chance, the next time they get favorable people in the White House and controlling the House and the Senate. They can't just reissue the rule under a new guise 5 years down the road. It's done. It's one and done for good, unless the Congress itself passes legislation specifically giving authorization to the agency to do that. So when you have a change of control of the House or the Senate, you will oftentimes now, you will see the Congress scouring previously issued rules that were issued in the last 6 months or so of the last session of the Congress. Those are the rules that will fall within the 60 legislative day window, and that will give the new House or the new Senate the opportunity to overturn some bad agency action. So that's the Congressional Review Act. That's what a resolution of disapproval is. Obviously, with President Biden in charge, we're not likely to see, even if one or two Democrats in the Senate decides to flip, as Senator Manchin did. There was a resolution, there was a CRA Act resolution of disapproval earlier on something. I can't remember which particular was it. It may have been the waters of the United States. That rule is particularly nettlesome for an awful lot of people. But just because it passes the House and may even pass the Senate, President Biden is likely to veto it. So that's what we need to keep an eye out for when we talk about the Congressional Review Act and resolutions of disapproval. Good question. Thank you for that. That's our Washington Report. Those are our calls to action for this week. We will see you next week. Until then, take action.